Dust settled on a fistful of crumpled $20 bills, the exact price of a father's life. 9-year-old Leo didn't understand the violent, fiercely guarded history behind the chrome and leather he had just traded away. He only knew his dad was dying, and absolute desperation breeds incredibly dangerous bargains. Summer in Bakersfield, California, did not forgive. It baked the cracked asphalt and turned the air inside the Callahan family's single-story ranch house into a suffocating, stagnant oven. In the master bedroom, the heavy rattling sound of Arthur Callahan's breathing echoed like a failing engine. Arthur, known to the men who rode alongside him simply as Artie, was a mountain of a man who had been reduced to a fragile shadow. Artie had spent 15 years as a fully patched member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, riding with the local charter. He had earned his patches through blood, loyalty, and an uncompromising code of brotherhood. He was a man who commanded respect, a former enforcer who had survived high-speed crashes and brutal barroom brawls without a scratch. But pride was a dangerous thing, and it was pride that had kept him entirely isolated when the aggressive pulmonary fibrosis began tearing through his lungs. When his wife Clara passed away from breast cancer 2 years prior, Artie had withdrawn from the world. He stopped attending church. He stopped seeing his friends, and eventually, he stopped showing up at the clubhouse. He told his brothers he needed time away to raise his son, Leo. The club respected his space, leaving him to grieve, entirely unaware that a silent, suffocating illness was slowly drowning him in his own bed. 9-year-old Leo sat on the edge of the frayed living room sofa, his knees pulled tight to his chest. He was a quiet, observant boy with his mother's bright hazel eyes and his father's stubborn jawline. For the past 3 weeks, Leo had been the sole caretaker of the house. He learned to boil water for oatmeal, wash clothes in the sink, and administer the fading supply of generic painkillers to his father. But the situation had rapidly escalated from dire to catastrophic. That morning, Artie had coughed up blood, his face pale and slick with a feverish sweat. The doctor had warned them weeks ago that without a specific, highly expensive regimen of prescription antibiotics and regular oxygen treatments, Artie's lungs would simply give out. The pharmacy in town had the medication sitting in a little white bag behind the counter, but it came with a price tag of $480. Leo had scoured the house. He emptied the swear jar, dug through the cushions of the armchair, and even checked the pockets of his mother's old winter coats. The grand total was $17.42. Walking into the attached garage, Leo felt a wave of oppressive heat mixed with the familiar, comforting scent of motor oil and stale tobacco. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was Artie's prized possession, a custom 1998 Harley-Davidson Fat Boy. It was a beautiful, intimidating machine. The paint was a deep, glossy midnight black, adorned with subtle crimson pinstriping. On the leather seat, meticulously tooled, was the iconic death head insignia of the Hells Angels. The bike was Artie's soul rendered in steel. He had built it, bled over it, and rode it across the country. Leo walked up to the motorcycle, running a small, trembling hand over the cold chrome of the handlebars. He remembered a time just a few months ago when a man in a greasy mechanic's shirt had stopped by the house to buy some scrap metal from the yard. The man's name was Silas Grimsby, a notorious local opportunist who ran a shady auto salvage yard on the edge of the county line. Silas had taken one look at the Harley in the open garage and whistled, his eyes glooming with greedy calculus. "Your old man ever wants to part with that sled, you tell him Silas pays cash," the man had said, flashing a stained, crooked smile. His father was going to die if he didn't get that medicine today. The club was a mystery to Leo. He only knew them as loud, bearded men who used to come over for barbecues and call him little brother. But they hadn't been around in months. Leo felt entirely alone. He made the decision with the terrifying, resolute clarity that only a desperate child can muster. He walked over to the workbench, grabbed his father's heavy set of keys, and pulled the old yellowed phone book from the bottom drawer. Flipping to the yellow pages under Auto Salvage, he traced his finger down until he found Grimsby's Pull and Pay. Leo picked up the greasy garage landline and dialed the number. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Grimsby," a gruff voice barked on the other end. "Mister?" Leo's voice cracked, sounding even smaller than he felt. "This is Leo Callahan, Artie's son. You said you pay cash for motorcycles." There was a heavy pause on the line. The sound of a lighter flicking and a sharp inhale of smoke drifted through the receiver. "Artie Callahan's kid? Your daddy know you're calling me, boy." "He's sick," Leo lied smoothly, his voice steadying. "He told me to call you." Silas Grimsby knew exactly who Artie Callahan was, and he knew damn well what a Hells Angels motorcycle meant. Buying a patched member's bike without the club's knowledge was tantamount to signing a death warrant. But Silas was a degenerate gambler with debts of his own, and a custom Fat Boy could be stripped, its parts shipped out of state, or sold whole to a private, unscrupulous buyer in Mexico for 10 times what he might pay a desperate kid. If Artie was sick enough to send his 9-year-old to make a deal, Silas figured the big man was already halfway in the grave. "I can be there in 20 minutes with the flatbed," Silas rasped. "You have the title?" "It's in the saddlebag," Leo said, remembering his father mentioning it once. "Keep the garage door shut until I pull up." "I don't want the whole neighborhood in my business." Leo hung up the phone. He looked at the gleaming motorcycle one last time, feeling a profound wave of guilt wash over him. He knew his father loved this machine more than anything else in the world, save for Leo and the memory of his mother. The Digamenegachsekho. Silas stepped out, a tall, skeletal man in a sweat-stained tank top, his eyes darting nervously up and down the quiet suburban street. He jogged up to the garage and tapped impatiently on the aluminum door. As the door ground upward, the harsh midday sun spilled over the Harley, illuminating the dust that danced in the air. Silas stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking onto the bike. He let out a low, appreciative whistle, but his face quickly hardened into a mask of feigned indifference. "Where's your old man?" Silas asked, peering toward the door that led into the house. "He's sleeping," Leo said, stepping between Silas and the door. "He can't come out. He said I'm supposed to do the deal." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He walked around the motorcycle, running a dirty hand over the custom leather seat, deliberately ignoring the red and white death head patch stitched into the rear. "It's in decent shape. Needs work, though. Tires are getting bald. Carburetor probably needs a rebuild if it's been sitting." It was entirely a lie. The bike was in pristine, show-quality condition. "He said it's worth a lot of money," Leo stated, crossing his arms, trying to mimic the tough stance he had seen his father take so many times. "Worth is subjective, kid," Silas sneered, pulling a wad of cash from his dirty denim pocket. He peeled off 5 $100 bills and held them out. "500? Cash right now." $500. It would leave him with $20 for groceries. He knew the bike was worth thousands, maybe tens of thousands, but he had no leverage, no time, and no understanding of the market. "Okay," Leo whispered, his voice trembling as he reached out and took the bills. They felt dirty, heavy with the weight of his betrayal. Silas didn't waste a second. Moving with frantic, nervous energy, he kicked the kickstand up, grabbed the heavy handlebars, and muscled the massive machine out of the garage and onto the tilted ramp of his flatbed trailer. He strapped it down with heavy ratchet tie-downs, his eyes constantly scanning the street. The moment the last strap was tight, Silas jumped into the cab of his truck, threw it into reverse, and sped out of the driveway. The beautiful black Harley looking like a captured animal secured to the rusted metal of the trailer. Leo watched the truck disappear around the corner. He didn't cry. He turned around, grabbed his bicycle, and pedaled harder and faster than he ever had in his life toward the pharmacy 3 miles away. An hour later, Leo walked back into the suffocating heat of the house. He was drenched in sweat, but in his arms, he clutched a brown paper grocery bag containing 3 boxes of macaroni and cheese, a loaf of bread, and a small white paper bag filled with heavy plastic prescription bottles. He rushed into his father's bedroom. Artie was awake, though barely. His eyes were half closed, his chest heaving with agonizing effort. The smell of sickness in the room was overwhelming. "Dad," Leo said softly, unscrewing the cap of the antibiotic syrup. "Dad, I got the medicine. You need to take this." Artie blinked, his vision blurry. He looked at the bottle, then at his son's exhausted, pale face. He tried to speak, but it triggered a brutal, rattling cough that shook his entire frame. Leo gently supported his father's head and poured the thick liquid into his mouth. Artie swallowed weakly, falling back onto the sweat-soaked pillows. "Good boy," Artie rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Where? How did you?" "Don't worry about it, Dad. Just rest. I've got you." The medicine was powerful. Within 2 hours, the aggressive fever that had been cooking Artie alive began to break. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long golden shadows across the bedroom floor, Artie felt a tiny surge of strength. He swung his heavy, tattooed legs over the side of the bed. The room spun, but he grounded himself by gripping the nightstand. He needed water. He needed to see his son. Artie shuffled down the hallway, leaning heavily against the wall. The house was quiet. He made his way to the kitchen, poured a glass of water from the tap, and drank it greedily. Feeling marginally human again, he walked toward the living room to find Leo. The wash. He noticed it was slightly ajar. Gad, the spot where his fat boy had sat for years was empty, leaving behind nothing but a faint outline of dust and a single drop of leaked oil. Leo! Artie roared, a sound born not of anger, but of absolute heart-stopping terror. Leo came running from the living room, his eyes wide. He saw the shattered glass, the empty garage, and the look of sheer horror on his father's face. Dad, I had to, Leo cried out, tears finally breaking free and streaming down his face. The medicine was so expensive, you were dying. I called the man from the salvage yard, Mr. Silas. He gave me $500. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Artie sank to his knees, disregarding the broken glass. He pulled his son into a desperate, crushing hug, burying his face in the boy's shoulder. He wasn't mad at Leo. He was devastated that he had failed so profoundly as a father that his 9-year-old son had to sell a piece of his soul to keep him breathing. But beneath the crushing wave of sorrow, a dark, icy dread began to pool in Artie's gut. Silas Grimsby, a local scumbag. Silas had a Hells Angels motorcycle, a club-badged bike. What Leo didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was the absolute sacredness of club property. A patched member's motorcycle was considered an extension of one, especially a known bottom feeder like Silas Grimsby. The club wouldn't ask questions. They would assume the bike was stolen. They would assume disrespect. And out in the city, the wheels of a brutal misunderstanding had already been set into motion. 20 miles away, parked outside a dingy roadside diner, A man named Dutch Bander sat astride his own roaring Harley. Dutch was a fully patched member of Artie's charter, a heavily bearded, quiet man who missed his missing brother. As Dutch took a drag from his cigarette, Silas Grimsby's rusted F-250 blew past the diner, the flatbed trailer rattling behind it. Dutch's eyes locked onto the trailer. He recognized the midnight black paint. He recognized the subtle crimson pinstriping. And most importantly, he recognized the custom death head stitched into the leather seat. It was Artie's sled. You didn't finish his cigarette. He flicked it onto the asphalt, kicked his bike into gear, and reached for the cell phone in his leather cut. Dutch Vander's thumb slammed the speed dial on his battered flip phone. Roaring down the state highway, he kept Silas Grimsby's rusted flatbed dead in his sights. Yeah. He's hauling Artie's fat boy. The clubhouse background noise instantly vanished. Every man in the charter knew Artie Callahan loved that midnight black motorcycle like a living entity. He would sooner part with his own right arm than let a bottom feeder touch it. You sure? Bull's voice dropped, dripping with quiet menace. Custom death head on the leather, Dutch confirmed. It's his. If Grimsby has the bike, Artie didn't give it up breathing. Stay on him, Bull commanded. He hung up, standing up in the dimly lit clubhouse. The dark energy radiating from him silenced the room. Someone touched Artie's sled. Within 10 minutes, the news spread like a gasoline fire. Members from neighboring charters dropped their tools and walked out of bars. To the Hells Angels, taking a member's bike was a profound act of disrespect. Blissfully unaware of the storm behind him, Silas Grimsby pulled into his chaotic razor-wire top salvage yard. The dock energy spread over. He had already lined up a shady Nevada buyer for $10,000 cash. Easiest 10 grand I ever made, Silas muttered, grabbing the ratchet straps. He never finished the thought. A low, rhythmic vibration built in the ground beneath his steel-toed boots, rattling the loose sheet metal in the yard. Silas paused, looking toward the dirt road. One motorcycle turned the corner. Then 10. Within 60 seconds, the road was entirely consumed by a tidal wave of roaring chrome. Over 200 Hells Angels flooded the area, forming an impenetrable wall of heavy machinery. The engines cut off in a synchronized, deafening silence. You have 10 seconds to tell me where Artie Callahan's body is, or I'm burying you under this scrap. Silas fell to his knees in the dirt. He ain't dead. I swear the kid sold it to me. Dutch gripped a heavy steel wrench at his belt. Artie wouldn't let his kid sell his sled to a rat. He didn't know. Silas screamed, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. The kid called me today, said his dad was sick and needed medicine money fast. I gave him $500. I swear on my mother's grave. The words hung in the dusty air. The murderous rage in Bull's chest instantly evaporated, replaced by a crushing weight of guilt. Artie wasn't dead, and he wasn't robbed. He was drowning in his own home, too relentlessly proud to ask his brothers for help. He had left his little boy so desperate that he traded his father's most prized possession for pocket change. Bull grabbed Silas by the tank top, hauled him up, and fished the truck keys from his pocket. He shoved the scrap dealer back into the dirt and tossed the keys to Dutch. We're taking the truck and the bike, Bull growled. He turned to face the massive crowd of waiting angels. Artie's sick, and his boy is fighting a war on his own. Mount up. We're going to Callahan's. Back at the quiet suburban ranch house, the sun had finally dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in deep bruises of purple and black. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Artie sat heavily in the armchair in the living room, a baseball bat resting against his leg. He was pale, sweating profusely, and every breath still required immense effort, but the antibiotics were holding the worst of the infection at bay. Leo sat on the floor near his father's boots, staring blankly at the television. He also knew that if the club found out Silas had the bike, the repercussions would be catastrophic. Artie was terrified that Silas would send thugs to secure the title, or worse, that the club would arrive to exact punishment on Artie for allowing a civilian to take possession of the club's colors. At 7:45 p.m., the floorboards of the house began to vibrate. It was a subtle trembling at first, like the very edge of an earthquake. Then, a low, guttural roar began to bleed through the walls. Leo looked up, his hazel eyes wide with sudden fear. He scrambled to his feet, running to the front window and pulling back the edge of the curtain. "Dad," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. Artie gripped the handle of the baseball bat and forced himself to stand, his lungs burning with the effort. He shuffled to the window and looked out over his son's shoulder. The quiet suburban street had been entirely overtaken. A seemingly endless procession of headlights cut through the dusk. 200 Hells Angels on heavy rumbling B-twins were rolling down the residential block, moving in a slow, disciplined formation. The neighbors' porch lights flicked off one by one as terrified residents locked their doors and peeked through their blinds. Sitting proudly on the back, illuminated by the street lamps, was the black and crimson Harley. Artie let the baseball bat slip from his fingers. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees right there in the living room, overwhelmed by a sudden, violent wave of emotion. They hadn't come to punish him. They had brought his soul back. A heavy knock echoed on the front door. Leo looked at his father, terrified. Artie nodded weakly, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. "Open it, Leo. It's family." Leo slowly turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Standing on the porch was Bull Hayes, looking like a giant in his heavy leather cut. Behind him stood Dutch, and beyond them, an ocean of imposing men lining the manicured lawns and sidewalks. Bull looked down at the 9-year-old boy. He noted the dark circles under Leo's eyes, the oversized, unwashed t-shirt, and the desperate, protective stance the small boy took in the doorway. Bull slowly dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to eye level with Leo. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, thousands of dollars, quietly collected from the pockets of 200 men in the span of 10 minutes. "You did a brave thing today, little brother," Bull said softly, his gravelly voice remarkably gentle. He pressed the stack of cash into Leo's trembling hands. "This is for the medicine, and the groceries, and whatever else you and your old man need." Bull stood up and looked past the boy, locking eyes with Artie, who was still kneeling weakly in the living room. The president walked inside, ignoring the cramped space, and knelt beside his brother. "You stupid, stubborn bastard," Bull whispered, wrapping a massive arm around Artie's shaking shoulders and pulling him into a fierce embrace. "You should have called us. You never fight alone. You know that." "I was too proud, Bull," Artie choked out, leaning heavily against his friend. "I couldn't let you see me like this." "Pride doesn't keep you warm, and it doesn't raise a son," Bull replied firmly, pulling back to look Artie in the eye. "We got the sled back. We got the rat who took it. And starting tonight, there will be 2 brothers stationed on this porch 24/7 until you are back on your feet. You eat, you rest, and you let us carry the weight." Outside, Dutch and 3 other men were unstrapping the Harley from the flatbed. With careful, reverent movements, they rolled the massive machine down the ramp, up the driveway, and back into the garage, setting the kickstand perfectly on the faint oil stain it had left behind hours earlier. Usine. Leo watched from the doorway, the sack of money clutched tightly against his chest. He looked out at the sea of leather and chrome, at the men with scarred faces and heavy boots. He realized then that he had misjudged them entirely. He had thought he was entirely alone in his fight to save his father, completely unaware that he had an army waiting in the wings, ready to ride to the ends of the earth at a moment's notice. The quiet suburban street, normally peaceful and isolated, now pulsed with the deep, protective heartbeat of 200 roaring engines. The roaring engines that shook the quiet Bakersfield street that evening weren't a sound of intimidation, but a symphony of salvation. A 9-year-old boy's desperate sacrifice bridged the gap between a father's stubborn pride and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood. The Hells Angels didn't just return a piece of stolen chrome. They brought a family back to life, proving that true loyalty rides deeper than blood.